The day Harold Brooks lifted Evan's laptop and slammed it against his skull, the sound cracked through the living room like a gavel delivering a final sentence. Blood ran warm down his temple. Harold's voice followed, jagged and cold. "You don't deserve a future, you're just a leech." To Evan, it wasn't just an attack on his body. It was the closing act of a story that had been written years before, in a house where love had rules and rules were made to exclude people like him. Evan Brooks grew up in a fading industrial town where the air always smelled faintly of rust and furnace smoke. His father, Harold, had spent decades in the steel mill, his hands calloused and his beliefs welded into something unyielding. His mother, Doris, was a homemaker who filled their small kitchen with the scent of boiled coffee, but rarely with warmth. In their world, anything outside their narrow definition of normal was suspect, dangerous or worse, shameful. At 15, Evan had made the mistake of falling in love with the idea of being understood. A string of tender, harmless messages to a boy from school had given him that brief, dizzy feeling of belonging, until Harold found them on his phone. That night, Harold's face twisted into something almost unrecognizable as he spat a word Evan had only ever heard whispered in disgust: pervert. From that moment on, every missed chore, every less than perfect grade, every perceived flaw was no longer just a failure, it was because you're gay. Doris never stepped between them. Sometimes she'd stay silent, staring at her hands as if the creases in her palms were more urgent than the words being thrown at her son. Other times, she would join in, parroting Harold's insults to keep herself out of his line of fire. Evan learned early that survival in that house meant making himself small, invisible, and silent. School became his lifeline. It was the one place where his worth could be measured by something other than the way he walked or the pitch of his voice. He stayed late in the library, clinging to textbooks like they were rafts keeping him above water. Teachers praised his essays, his sharp mind, his quiet persistence. Yet at home, every success was met with suspicion or indifference. Harold would glance at an A on a report card and mutter that book smarts won't make you a man. The cruelty was never just in the moments of yelling, it was in the constant undercurrent. The way Harold's eyes would narrow when Evan lingered too long over an art project, or how Doris would quickly turn the television when a gay character appeared on screen. Each slight, each dismissal, chipped away at him, but also built something stubborn in its place. By the time he was 17, Evan had learned to pour all that defiance into his work. His dreams were no longer about fitting into his family's vision of him. They were about escape. He imagined himself in a world where the sound of footsteps outside his bedroom door didn't make him tense, where the word home didn't mean a place to be endured. And yet, that day, the day of the shattered laptop, would not come for years. For now, he carried on in silence, enduring the insults, storing away each one like fuel for a fire he couldn't yet light. He told himself that one day, when he finally stepped out of that house for good, it wouldn't be as the boy they had tried to break. It would be as the man they never saw coming. If you've ever been rejected by the very people who were supposed to love you first, you'll understand why this story matters. Follow Heart's story for more journeys of survival, resilience, and the kind of victories that prove no one else gets to decide your worth. The letter arrived in an envelope so ordinary that Harold barely glanced at it when he tossed the mail onto the kitchen table. Evan waited until the house was quiet, until the hum of the refrigerator was the only sound. Before he slid it open, the words inside felt almost unreal. A full scholarship to State University. Tuition, housing, books, all covered. It was more than an acceptance. It was a ticket out. He read the letter twice, then folded it carefully and slid it under a loose plank in his bedroom floor. Not out of superstition, but survival. In this house, good news for him was ammunition for Harold. When the truth came out, it did exactly what Evan had feared. Harold didn't congratulate him. He didn't even pretend to care. His first words, after skimming the letter Evan had been cornered into showing, were a sneer about those universities full of degenerates. He said going there would ruin him. that whatever was left of him that could be fixed would be gone forever. Doris stood at the counter, peeling potatoes with short, sharp motions, her silence the same answer it had always been. Evan packed quietly over the next weeks, tucking clothes into a battered suitcase he had found at a thrift store, wrapping his laptop charger in an old t-shirt. There was no talk of helping him move, no offers of a ride to campus. He didn't expect any. On the morning he left, he didn't look back at the peeling paint of the front door or the sagging porch. The only thing he carried besides his luggage was the knowledge that the air outside felt different, lighter. The first days at State University were a kind of cautious relief. He walked through brick pathways lined with oaks, hearing laughter that didn't feel like it was aimed at him. In class, professors spoke to him as though his ideas mattered. He ate in crowded dining halls without wondering if someone was studying the way he held a fork. But the safety he felt on campus didn't erase the reflexes he'd built over years. When someone asked where he was from, he gave vague answers. He avoided mentioning anything about dating or the friends he was beginning to make outside of class. The thought of it reaching back to the town he'd left of Hurled, knowing anything about his life, now kept his guard high. Graduation came faster than he expected. On that day, dressed in the robe the university had loaned him, he stood among hundreds of students, their families waving from the stands, the sound of cheering and camera shutters blending into the warm air. Evan clutched his diploma as his name was read, walked the stage with his head high, and stepped down into the crowd of bright faces searching for loved ones. No one was there for him, and there were no flowers, no proud smiles, no hand squeezing his shoulder. It should have felt hollow, but he realized it didn't. His presence there, his survival, his achievement was its own statement, and even without applause, he knew he had crossed a line that could never be erased. The absence of his family that day didn't mark a loss. It confirmed a truth he had learned long before. Recognition from the wrong people is worth nothing, but the recognition you earn for yourself can be the foundation for a life no one can take from you. That was the quiet lesson he carried forward, the one that would matter most when the past tried to find its way back in. The years after graduation brought a different kind of challenge. Evan had been accepted into a graduate program. His research focused on something deeply personal, the academic resilience of first-generation LGBT students. It was the kind of work that mattered not only to him, but to people who might never meet him, yet still benefit from his voice. He had secured a small stipend and the freedom to pursue the project, but the stipend barely covered rent. When a cheap apartment opened up in a town just miles from his parents' house, he took it. It seemed practical. He didn't realize at the time that proximity could still be a form of vulnerability. The first weeks back in that old geography were a strange mix of independence and unease. The steel-gray skyline of the mill loomed in the distance. He told himself it didn't matter, that his life was separate now. But somehow, Harold and Doris found ways to drift in. They never knocked when they came by. And when Evan didn't answer the phone, they'd show up under the guise of checking in. Harold would park himself in the living room, flicking through channels until he found a sports game and turning the volume up just as Evan was trying to work. His younger brother Frank had grown into a man who carried himself with Harold's swagger but sharpened it with mockery. If Harold wielded blunt force, Frank preferred needles. Passing through the kitchen one afternoon, he smirked and asked Evan when he was planning to get that professor boyfriend so he could stop pretending to work. It was the kind of jab designed to land deep but leave no visible wound. Doris, in her usual way, added her own barbed commentary, half smiling as she asked why he didn't find a rich husband and be done with the struggle. Through it all, Evan kept working. His thesis research demanded long hours of interviews, data coding, and writing. The subject was close to his heart, and he poured himself into it with a focus that left little room for anything else. He often worked late into the night, his small apartment lit by the cool glow of his laptop, stacks of notes spread across the table like a paper fortress. 2 days before the submission deadline, exhaustion had settled into his bones. He had been awake for 36 hours, chasing perfection in his final draft. The writing was nearly complete when Harold appeared. uninvited, in the doorway. Evan barely looked up, too focused on aligning the final citations. Without a word, Harold walked to the router in the corner of the dining room and yanked the cord from the wall. Evan froze. "I need that," he managed, but Harold's voice cut through the air. "You don't deserve a future. You're just a gay freeloader." The words were delivered not with heat, but with something worse, conviction. Harold stood there, blocking the way, and when Evan tried to move past, his father's hand gripped his arm, fingers digging into muscle. It wasn't enough to leave a bruise, but it was enough to make his point. That night, Evan backed up what he could from his files at a friend's place, his mind running on adrenaline and the thinnest thread of determination. He understood, in a way he hadn't before, that success in the presence of people who want you to fail isn't just about talent or hard work. It's about defending your progress against those who resent it. And perhaps the most dangerous sabotage isn't the kind that smashes windows or burns bridges. It's the quiet, deliberate disruption meant to make you trip just before the finish line. Recognizing it for what it is can be the first step in refusing to let it work. The night before his thesis deadline, the apartment felt heavier than usual. Pages of printed drafts lay scattered across the dining table, the margins marked in red ink, a testament to weeks of obsessive revisions. Evan's laptop hummed softly, the only sound besides the faint tapping of his fingers on the keys. He was down to final adjustments, polishing sentences, refining his citations. The fatigue was deep but purposeful. He could almost taste the relief of finishing. The sound of the front door creaking open broke his concentration. Harold stepped in without warning, his steel-toed boots dull against the linoleum. Doris followed, her arms folded, a smirk tugging at her mouth. Frank lingered just behind them. None of them spoke right away. Harold's gaze swept the room, landing on the laptop like it was the source of all his grievances. Without preamble, Harold strode forward and reached for the device. Evan's hands tightened on the edge of the table. "Don't," he said, the single word calm but edged with desperation. Harold's reply was physical. He tore the laptop free, and before Evan could rise from his chair, the metal casing slammed against the side of his head. The pain was blinding. A sharp, metallic crack filled his ears, followed by the warm rush of blood down his temple. The laptop hit the floor with a hollow thud, the screen spiderwebbed, fragments scattering across the tiles. Evan swayed, his vision momentarily fracturing into light and shadow. Doris didn't move to help. She laughed a low, humorless sound that seemed to strip the air from the room. Frank stepped forward just enough to be seen, his expression unreadable, and said, "You should have known better." The words were colder than the blow. Instinct pushed Evan toward the door. He stumbled into the night, the cool air hitting his face like a shock. His car was parked half a block away. He gripped the steering wheel with trembling hands, blood still trailing along his jaw. Every bump in the road on the way to campus made his skull throb. But he kept driving, each turn taking him further from the place he'd once called home. By the time he reached the campus health center, his thoughts had narrowed to survival. The nurse who opened the door didn't ask questions at first. She guided him to a bed, cleaned the wound, and called a doctor. The diagnosis came quickly: a concussion, a 4-stitch laceration, and the quiet note that law enforcement would need to be contacted. His academic advisor arrived soon after, her presence a steadying force amid the chaos. She listened, took notes, and made calls. Housing was arranged immediately, away from the reach of anyone who could harm him. The school's IT department worked through the night to salvage his work from the wreckage of the laptop. Against all odds, most of it was recovered. The department granted him an extension, and days later, he submitted his thesis later than planned, but complete. When the results came back, they weren't just good. He had earned the program's highest honors. With the diploma came something else, a legal order preventing Harold and Doris from contacting him. It was a line drawn in law as well as in life. The lesson was harsh but indelible. Leaving a toxic environment is not betrayal, it is self-preservation. And sometimes it's not enough to walk away. You have to close the door so firmly that those who tried to break you can never step through it again. 2 months passed before anyone from his family dared to approach. Evan had settled into a rhythm in his small office at the university, sunlight slanting across shelves lined with research journals and framed certificates. The days were full but quiet, the kind of quiet that heals. He had begun mentoring younger students, some of them LGBT, many of them the first in their families to set foot in a college classroom. His own scars, both visible and invisible, were slowly becoming part of the story he told to encourage others. That afternoon, a soft knock at his office door interrupted his work. He expected a student with questions about an assignment. Instead, Frank stepped inside. The sight of him was like a sudden gust of cold air. Frank's usual swagger was gone, replaced by a cautious hesitation that made him look older than his years. He closed the door slowly, almost as if asking permission without words. "I know I don't deserve to be here," he began, his voice low. He didn't try to excuse himself or rewrite the past. Instead, he admitted that he had seen everything: the insults, the sabotage, the blow that split the skin on Evan's temple. He had known it was wrong, but he had stood by, afraid of Harold, unwilling to break the family's cruel code of silence. Evan listened without interrupting, his hands folded on the desk. Frank reached into a backpack and pulled out a sleek, unopened laptop box, sliding it across the wood. "This doesn't change what happened," he said, "but I don't want the last thing you remember from me to be silence." The gesture caught Evan off guard. The weight of it wasn't in the hardware. It was in the unspoken acknowledgement that what had been taken from him could never be replaced, but some things could still be given freely. He thanked Frank, not for the object, but for showing up in a way he never had before. In the days that followed, Evan found himself reflecting on what victory really meant. It wasn't the degree on his wall or the honors he had earned, though those mattered. It was the fact that he no longer lived under the shadow of someone else's prejudice. He spoke openly now about who he was, without flinching, without editing himself for comfort. He had built a life where the people around him saw his worth without condition. The truth was, family could be chosen. It could be made of friends who cheered at your smallest victories, mentors who stayed late to guide you, students who looked at you and saw possibility. The love that had been withheld at home was no longer a wound that controlled him. It was a space that had been filled with something stronger, something earned. Sometimes the greatest defiance against a lifetime of rejection is not in proving them wrong, but in living so fully that their opinion no longer has any weight. And sometimes even those who once stayed silent will find their way back, not to erase the past, but to admit they were wrong and to join you in the present. Have you ever had someone who once hurt you return with a gesture you didn't expect? Share your thoughts in the comments and follow Heart Story for more true journeys of resilience, justice, and the families we choose.